When the sirens echoed across the lake that morning, I knew the fight had finally reached its breaking point. What started as a simple property purchase, a quiet retreat away from noise, neighbors, and the past, had turned into something darker, something that crawled under my skin and refused to let go. I remember standing by the rusted gate, the mist rising from the water like smoke, as red and blue lights danced across the surface. They weren't here for a crime. They were here because of rules. Rules written by people who believed their power over lawns and fences could rival federal law itself. I once thought the HOA was just a nuisance, a few bored residents clinging to control. But I was wrong. They were a machine built on fear and authority, and the woman who ran it, the one in the pink suit, treated every inch of land like it was her empire. I had seen her smile at me like a wolf sizing up its next meal, promising civility while plotting chaos. And when she realized she couldn't break me with fines, meetings, and threats, she tried something else, something far more dangerous. There's a moment every person reaches, the instant you realize you're no longer defending property but principle, when silence becomes surrender, and you have to decide what kind of person you'll be when the gate finally closes. I never asked for a war, but I learned quickly that some people can't stand losing control, especially when it's to someone they underestimated. By the time the sheriff's cruiser pulled up that day, I had already gathered every document, every code, every line of law they never thought I'd understand. I knew this wasn't just about a lake anymore. It was about truth, and what they were hiding beneath the surface. Because out here in Pine Ridge County, property lines don't just divide land. They divide power, secrets, and survival. So before you judge what I did next, ask yourself one thing. How far would you go to protect what's yours? When the people trying to take it think they own the law itself, Pine Ridge County wasn't the kind of place that made the news. It was quiet, tucked between rolling hills and thick pines, where the mornings began with the hum of sprinklers and the evenings ended with the soft glow of porch lights reflecting off still water. The air always carried that faint scent of pine and lake mist, something pure, something that made you believe life here was simple. But like every perfect picture, it was only peaceful until you looked close enough to see the cracks. The lake I bought sat at the far edge of the county, a forgotten stretch of water once used by fishermen decades ago, before the new developments came in and swallowed everything rustic and real. The property had been abandoned for years, its old dock half sunken, reeds crawling up its posts. The gate was bent, the sign half buried. Private property, no trespassing. Most people avoided it. They said the lake was useless now, that it didn't belong to anyone. But I saw something different. To me, it was freedom. An untouched piece of land where no one could tell me how tall my grass could be or what color I could paint my front door. After 10 years of working for the Army Corps of Engineers, I wanted silence, solitude, and something I could truly call my own. I remember the first morning there. The sun cut through the fog, painting the lake gold. My small cabin, weighed little more than wood, steel, and quiet dreams, sat near the shore. Birds skimming the surface, the smell of wet earth, and that satisfying creak of the dock under my boots. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I'd found peace. That peace lasted exactly 48 hours. The first time I saw her, she came marching down the gravel path like she owned the ground beneath her feet. A bright pink suit, heels sinking slightly into the dirt, clipboard tucked under one arm. Her name was Karen Holt, president of the Pine Ridge Homeowners Association. She didn't smile the way friendly people smile. She smiled the way politicians do when they're about to deliver bad news. "Good morning," she said sweetly, scanning the property. "You must be new here," I nodded, still holding my coffee. "Just got settled." "Well," she said, "I'm sure you know this lake falls under the jurisdiction of the HOA." I shook my head. "Not anymore. It's private property, bought, signed, and filed with the county office." Her smile didn't fade. If anything, it sharpened. "Oh, I see. We'll have to verify that. It's just we've always maintained this lake. Community standards, you know." I didn't respond, just handed her a copy of the deed. She looked at it long enough to register the seal and then handed it back, that same sugary tone coating her words. "Of course, we'll look into it." Then she turned and walked off, heels crunching on gravel, posture rigid with control. That was my first red flag. Later, I learned that Karen had been HOA president for nearly 7 years, longer than anyone before her. The community worshipped her publicly and whispered about her privately. She was known for her zero-tolerance approach to rule-breaking. Unapproved mailboxes? Fine. A car parked too long in the street? Fine, Jim. A fence half an inch too high? Fine, and a written notice. Her entire identity was tied to those rules, to the belief that order meant power. And in her mind, the lake, even if abandoned, was part of her empire. Over the next few days, I started meeting the rest of the HOA board, whether I wanted to or not. There was Paul Henley, the vice president, a man whose handshake lasted too long, whose eyes darted like he was always calculating something. He had a permanent tan from golfing 3 times a week and a voice that could charm anyone until they disagreed with him. Then there was Linda Rowe, the treasurer, a soft-spoken woman who seemed harmless enough, though she took notes on everything, every conversation, every glance, every detail. And finally, Tom Bates, the maintenance coordinator, who spoke little but seemed to appear wherever Karen did, always standing behind her, arms crossed like her shadow. Together, they made quite the team. Smiling faces at bake sales, cheerful waves at community picnics, but their friendliness had a leash. And if you stepped outside their circle, that smile turned cold fast. For a while, I tried to stay out of it. My property wasn't inside their community lines. It bordered them, but that didn't stop them from acting like it did. Within a week, I started receiving letters, not official government letters, just notes on HOA letterhead demanding I remove unauthorized structures and comply with community aesthetics. They weren't even subtle about it. The words "subject to penalties" were underlined 3 times. At first I laughed. It was absurd. Then I realized they weren't joking. One morning I caught Paul and Tom near the gate, measuring tape in hand. "Morning," I called out. They froze. "Checking the fence?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Just routine maintenance," Paul said smoothly. "Making sure boundaries are properly aligned." "Boundaries are fine," I replied, stepping closer. "County surveyed them last month. You can check the report." They nodded, pretending to be agreeable. But as I walked away, I could feel their eyes on my back. There was something territorial in their gaze, something that said they didn't like being told no. The first week ended with another note, this one taped directly to my gate. It read, "Failure to comply with HOA standards may result in legal action. No signature, just the HOA emblem stamped at the bottom." By then, I understood what I was up against. These people weren't just enforcing rules, they were defending an illusion of control. And the more I resisted, the more determined they became to break me. It was subtle at first, a scratch on my mailbox, tire tracks near the dock, small acts that could be dismissed as coincidence. But then came the drone. One evening, just after sunset, I noticed a faint buzzing over the lake. A small black drone hovered near the cabin, its red light blinking as it drifted closer to my porch. I watched it in silence for a few seconds before raising my flashlight. The beam hit its lens, and it swerved away, vanishing into the trees. The next morning, a new letter appeared. Unapproved surveillance equipment is not allowed within HOA boundaries. That's when I realized they were playing a game, and they thought I didn't know the rules. I spent my days working on repairs, restoring the dock, cleaning the shoreline, and installing new signs to reinforce my claim. But the feeling of being watched never left. Every time I heard tires on gravel or voices beyond the trees, I knew who it was. And every time I felt the same tightness in my chest. Not fear exactly, but something heavier. The sense that my peace was being chipped away, one petty intrusion at a time. A few neighbors warned me quietly, the ones who lived closest to the edge of the HOA's power. They told me stories, small, almost unbelievable things. A family forced to repaint their house 3 times in one summer because the board didn't like the tone. A man fined for leaving his trash can visible for more than an hour. An elderly woman who lost her flower beds because they violated community harmony. It sounded ridiculous, until I realized that behind every petty demand was the same pattern. Compliance through exhaustion. That's what they wanted from me. Surrender, not money. I thought about leaving. I really did. But then I'd walk out onto the dock, feel the wind across the water, and remember why I came here. This wasn't just a property. It was proof that I could build something for myself, something untouchable. And I wasn't going to let anyone take that away. Still, there were moments, quiet, uneasy ones, when I wondered if I had underestimated them. Like the night I found the lock on my gate broken, the chain neatly cut as if someone wanted to make a point. Or the morning I discovered a community access sign nailed to a tree on my land. Each small act chipped away at something deeper, not just anger, but trust. Trust in people, in fairness, in reason. The more I resisted, the more hostile they became. Karen stopped pretending to be polite. The pink suit became her armor, and her smile turned into a weapon. She started showing up with backup. Other board members, clipboards in hand, eyes gleaming with self-importance. Every visit followed the same pattern. A polite greeting, a meaningless accusation, and a threat wrapped in bureaucracy. It wasn't about the lake anymore. It was about control, about one woman's obsession with keeping her tiny kingdom intact, even if it meant breaking the law to do it. But there was something she didn't know, something none of them did. I had spent a decade studying land, water, and federal codes. I knew every jurisdictional line, every clause that could overturn local ordinances. I knew exactly how far their authority went, and how easily it could crumble when challenged. That knowledge became my shield. And as their pressure grew, I started preparing, quietly, carefully, keeping records, documenting everything, because deep down, I knew this wasn't going to end with letters or threats. It was going to end with a fight. And when it did, I would be ready not just to defend my land, but to expose what they really were. A group of self-appointed rulers who believed they could bend the law to their will. They had no idea the storm they were calling down. And as the days grew colder and the tension thicker, I could feel it coming, a confrontation neither of us could avoid. The lake was calm. But beneath that still surface, something dangerous was stirring. The first letter arrived on a quiet Monday morning, a thin white envelope tucked neatly between utility bills and grocery coupons, the kind of thing most people wouldn't think twice about. But for Emma, it would become the spark that ignited months of relentless chaos. She tore it open casually while sipping her coffee, her cat purring at her feet, sunlight spilling across the kitchen counter. The letterhead read, Maple Ridge Homeowners Association, printed in bold, unforgiving letters. Inside a single paragraph, a notice of violation, citing her for unauthorized alterations to the property. The so-called alteration? A small wooden flower box beneath her window, the same one she had built with her late father the year before. At first, Emma laughed. It had to be a mistake. Her father had built that planter to honor her mother, who used to fill the yard with lilies every spring. How could something so harmless, so sentimental, be considered a violation? She placed the letter on the counter and decided to handle it later. But later came faster than she expected. Another letter, then another, each one sterner than the last. Soon they weren't just notes about flower boxes. The HOA claimed her grass was an inch too long. Her trash cans weren't positioned at the right angle. Her car, parked in her own driveway, apparently violated aesthetic uniformity guidelines. Each letter felt colder than the one before, each word calculated to chip away at her calm. When Emma attended the next HOA meeting to resolve things, she walked into a room that felt less like a neighborhood gathering and more like a courtroom. At the center sat Greg Peterson, the HOA president, a man whose permanent frown seemed carved into his face. He adjusted his tie as Emma tried to explain, his voice measured, his tone dripping with superiority. "Rules are rules, Ms. Clark," he said, as if reciting a sacred scripture. Around the table, the other board members, Linda, with her fake politeness, Robert, who always nodded in silent agreement, sat like a jury waiting to convict. She tried to reason with them, showing pictures, offering to modify the planter. But every attempt was met with bureaucratic smirks and dismissive glances. When she left the meeting, the air outside felt heavier, the kind of weight that only comes from being silently cornered. The following week, her mailbox overflowed with fines: $50 for the planter, $100 for repeated non-compliance, $200 for continued disregard of HOA policy. By the end of the month, her total reached over $1,000, a cruel sum for something so trivial. Her neighbors began whispering. Some avoided eye contact when she passed by. Others sent her sympathetic looks, but said nothing. That's how the HOA worked, through fear, through silence. Nobody wanted to be next, but Emma refused to bow. She had spent years saving for this house, building a life of her own after losing her parents. She wasn't about to let a handful of power-hungry neighbors dictate how she lived. Yet, as she pushed back, the HOA pushed harder. A citation arrived accusing her of unauthorized gatherings because her sister had come over for dinner. Then came threats of legal action if she didn't comply. It was absurd, surreal even, how quickly things escalated. She began documenting everything, every letter, every photo, every whispered warning from other residents who had suffered quietly under the same oppressive board. One elderly man down the street, Mr. Hanley, confessed that the HOA had fined him for having a flagpole too tall by regulation standards. Another neighbor, Clara, had received a citation for wind chimes deemed audibly disruptive. It was no longer just about Emma's planter, it was about control. The HOA wasn't protecting property values. It was feeding on submission. The more Emma resisted, the more personal it became. Greg started showing up outside her property during inspection rounds, clipboard in hand, lingering just long enough for her to notice. Linda, the secretary, began posting passive-aggressive notes on the community bulletin about residents who refused to follow the code. Even her mail began arriving opened, though no one would admit to it. The neighborhood, once peaceful and friendly, began to feel like a maze of quiet eyes and whispered threats. Emma's anxiety turned into anger. One night she sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by piles of fines and letters, her hands trembling. She realized that this wasn't just harassment, it was war. She began digging through HOA bylaws, uncovering contradictions, loopholes, and misused authority. The deeper she went, the darker it got. The board had been using HOA funds for personal expenses, quietly raising fees without approval, and targeting anyone who questioned them. It was systemic corruption hiding behind manicured lawns and community standards. And Emma, without realizing it, had just become their biggest threat. Her small acts of defiance became bolder. She started speaking to other homeowners, collecting stories, building a case. Each conversation revealed another horror: retirees bullied into selling, single parents driven into debt, veterans fined for displaying flags. Emma wasn't just fighting for her flower box anymore. She was fighting for the neighborhood's soul. The HOA responded with ruthless precision. One morning she woke up to find a bright orange sign posted on her lawn: "Property under review." It was meant to humiliate her, to make her neighbors see her as a problem. But instead it lit a fire inside her. She refused to move that sign. She left it standing there like a badge of defiance. As weeks turned into months, the situation spiraled. Meetings grew more heated, letters more aggressive, and the board's patience thinner. Greg, once calm and smug, began losing his composure in public. "You think you're some kind of hero?" he shouted in one meeting. "You're just a troublemaker." But Emma didn't back down. "Maybe," she said, meeting his glare, "but at least I'm not afraid to stand up for what's right." Each clash left ripples through the neighborhood. Some residents began quietly cheering her on, leaving supportive notes in her mailbox. Others feared the fallout and stayed silent. Still, something was shifting. For the first time, people were questioning the authority they'd blindly accepted for years. Emma was exhausted, but determined. Every letter, every threat only hardened her resolve. The HOA had underestimated her. They thought she would fold under pressure, like so many before her. But she wasn't fighting just to win. She was fighting to expose the truth, and as she prepared her final move, one that would shake the entire community, the tension reached a breaking point. Every window, every whisper in the neighborhood seemed to carry the same question. Who would break first, the HOA or Emma Clark? The stage was set for a battle that would define not just her future, but the very meaning of justice behind the white fences and pristine lawns of Maple Ridge. The day of reckoning began under a heavy, gray sky, the kind that seemed to press down on the rooftops of Maple Ridge like an omen. Rain threatened in the distance, the air thick with that electric stillness before a storm. For months, Emma Clark had endured everything the HOA could throw at her, the fines, the threats, the humiliation. But today was different. Today was the day she would stand her ground and fight back with every piece of evidence she had gathered. By now, the HOA had crossed every imaginable line. Greg Peterson and his board head filed an official motion to foreclose on Emma's home, her sanctuary, claiming she owed thousands in unpaid fines and legal recovery fees. The absurdity of it was staggering. They were trying to take her house because of a flower box. And yet, as far as the HOA was concerned, it wasn't personal. It was policy enforcement. But for Emma, it was deeply personal. This wasn't just about property anymore. It was about dignity, truth, and the right to live free from tyranny disguised as neighborhood harmony. When she walked into the community hall that evening, every eye turned toward her. The air was thick with tension, the kind that hums beneath polite smiles and tight jawlines. The board sat behind their long table like judges at a trial, Greg in the center, his smug expression half hidden behind his glasses. Linda sat to his right, clutching a stack of papers like a weapon. Robert stared down at the table, avoiding Emma's gaze. The meeting began with the usual formalities, call to order, attendance, the monotone recitation of the agenda. But the moment Greg mentioned Item 6, property violation and foreclosure motion, the air shifted. Emma stood up before he could continue. Her voice was steady, but her pulse raced. "I'd like to address that motion," she said. Greg smirked. "You'll have your 3 minutes, Ms. Clark, just like everyone else." She looked around the room, her neighbors packed into the chairs, their faces a mixture of curiosity, sympathy, and fear. She took a breath. "No, tonight you're going to hear the truth, whether you give me permission or not." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Greg's smile faltered. Emma reached into her bag and pulled out a thick binder, her weapon. Inside were months of documents, letters, photos, and financial records she had painstakingly collected. Every page was a piece of a puzzle that painted a much darker picture of the HOA's corruption. She laid the binder on the table with a thud that echoed across the room. "You say I've broken the rules," she said, her voice rising. "But what about the rules you've broken, Greg?" He opened his mouth to protest, but she didn't let him. "I have bank statements showing HOA funds being used for personal expenses, gas receipts, restaurant tabs, hotel stays, all billed to the association. I have records of unauthorized fee increases, hidden votes, and violations you conveniently ignored for your friends. You think you're untouchable because you hide behind policy and paperwork, but you're not above the law." The room erupted. People whispered, gasped, leaned forward. Greg's composure cracked. His voice trembled as he barked. "That's a serious accusation." Emma locked eyes with him. "So is trying to take someone's home." Linda fumbled with the papers in front of her. "This is out of order." "No," Emma cut in. "What's out of order is an HOA president using his power to bully and silence residents. What's out of order is threatening foreclosure over a flower box while you're secretly draining community funds. And what's really out of order," she said, stepping closer, "is thinking no one would ever stand up to you." The tension was electric. Neighbors who had once stayed silent began murmuring their agreement. One man stood up. "She's right," he said. "They fined me for painting my shutters the wrong shade of beige." Another voice followed. "They threatened me over my garden fence." Then another. "I paid extra fees for landscaping that never happened." The crowd's frustration exploded into a storm of voices. Greg tried to regain control, pounding his gavel and shouting, "Order! Order!" But the sound was swallowed by the rising chorus of anger. Emma waited until the noise began to subside, then spoke again, calm and deliberate. "You've built this community on fear," she said. "You made good people believe they had no choice but to obey. But fear only works until someone refuses to play along." She reached into her bag again and held up a flash drive. "Everything I've shown tonight, and more, has already been sent to the county inspector and the local news station. By tomorrow morning, everyone will know what's been happening here." Greg's face went pale. Linda's hand dropped from her stack of papers. Robert finally looked up, his expression filled with regret. For a moment, the entire room was silent, the kind of silence that falls when a secret finally loses its power. Greg leaned forward, his voice trembling with barely contained rage. "You'll regret this," he hissed. Emma smiled faintly. "Maybe, but at least I'll regret it on my own terms." The storm outside finally broke, thunder cracking in the distance. Rain began tapping against the windows, steady and relentless. The meeting dissolved into chaos. Board members arguing, residents demanding explanations, Greg shouting over the noise. Emma stepped back, her heart pounding, her hands shaking, but she didn't move until she saw it in their eyes, the realization that their reign was over. That night, she returned home to her quiet street. The orange sign still stood on her lawn, soaked by the rain. She walked over to it, gripped the stake, and pulled it from the ground. The wood splintered under her hand, but she didn't care. She tossed it aside and stood in the downpour, breathing deeply for the first time in months. But the battle wasn't entirely over. The next morning, she woke to flashing lights and news vans parked along the curb. The story had gone public. Local HOA accused of corruption and harassment. Reporters huddled under umbrellas, microphones in hand, eager for a quote. Emma gave them the facts and nothing more. The rest, she knew, would speak for itself. Within days, the community fractured. Longtime residents demanded an emergency vote to remove Greg and the board. Some refused to believe the truth at first, but the evidence was undeniable. Checks written to cash, invoices for non-existent services, and personal vacations billed as association retreats. The HOA's carefully constructed facade crumbled in real time. Greg tried to fight back. He sent out frantic emails claiming Emma had fabricated everything. But the county audit confirmed every detail. Soon after, he resigned under pressure, his once commanding voice reduced to a bitter whisper. Linda followed, her reputation shattered. Robert, the quiet one, approached Emma privately, apologizing for his silence. "I should have spoken up," he said quietly. Emma looked at him for a long moment before replying, "Then start now." He did. He testified at the hearings, helping expose the depth of the corruption. By the end of the month, the HOA was placed under temporary state supervision. The remaining board members were stripped of authority until new elections could be held. Emma's victory wasn't loud or flashy. It was quiet, steady, like the calm after a long storm. But the impact rippled through every corner of Maple Ridge. For the first time in years, neighbors began talking openly, helping one another, repainting, planting, rebuilding what fear had taken. The community that had once felt like a cage began to breathe again, and Emma, though exhausted, felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: peace. Yet even in victory, there was a lingering tension, a realization of how fragile freedom truly is. She knew there would always be people like Greg hiding behind authority and rules, but she also knew that silence was their greatest weapon, and she had taken that away from them. A week after the scandal broke, Emma stood in her front yard, gazing at her flower box, the one her father built. The lilies were blooming again, their colors bright against the morning light. She knelt down, brushing the petals with her fingers. Somewhere in the distance, a neighbor's laughter drifted through the air, a sound that had been missing for far too long. Her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "You didn't just win your fight. You helped all of us find our voice." Emma smiled softly, slipping the phone into her pocket. The rain had washed away more than the dirt from the sidewalks. It had cleansed something deeper. That evening, as the sun set behind the rows of identical houses, Emma sat on her porch, watching the lights flicker on across the street. She thought of every sleepless night, every moment she almost gave up, every cruel letter and mocking smile, and realized it had all led to this. She didn't just defeat an HOA, she had exposed the truth hiding beneath perfect lawns and polite facades. The truth. That real strength doesn't come from power, but from courage. And as the last light faded, she whispered to herself, "They wanted me to be quiet." But silence was never my strength. The camera would linger on her face, the faint, defiant smile of someone who fought for her home and won, before fading into the dark. The story complete. The morning after the storm that changed everything, the neighborhood was eerily quiet. The streets of Maple Ridge, usually trimmed and spotless, carried a faint sense of unrest, not chaos, but awakening. The manicured perfection that once symbolized control now looked hollow, stripped of the illusion it had always carried. The neighbors who once looked through their curtains in silence now stood outside in small clusters, whispering, questioning, and, for the first time, sharing the truth aloud. Emma Clark watched from her window as the first HOA meeting notice after the scandal went up on the community board. But this time, the paper wasn't signed by Greg Peterson or Linda Carter. It was a county notice, temporary administrative oversight hearing. The words alone sent ripples through the cul-de-sac. The HOA that had ruled with arrogance and intimidation was officially under investigation. Within a week, the county's audit report became public. It revealed a web of deceit that stunned even the most loyal residents. Greg had used association funds for personal vacations, home renovations, and lavish dinners disguised as board retreats. Linda had approved unauthorized fines and pocketed portions of late fees. Robert's name appeared on documents he hadn't signed, proof that his signature had been forged to push through financial decisions. The report ignited fury. Homeowners who had once nodded obediently during meetings now flooded Greg's inbox with demands for his resignation. When he refused, claiming the accusations were exaggerated, the county filed formal charges for embezzlement, fraud, and abuse of power. The same people who once feared him now watched with satisfaction as he was escorted out of his office by deputies, his confident stride replaced by a quiet shuffle. The following month felt like the community's reckoning. Maple Ridge transformed into something it had never been before, honest. Conversations that had long been buried beneath polite small talk finally surfaced. People shared their stories. The elderly couple fined for planting roses that didn't match HOA-approved color palettes. The single mother who received a warning for leaving her trash cans out 10 minutes too long. The veteran threatened with foreclosure because his American flag was too large. Each story added another layer to the truth, another crack in the mask of community standards. When new elections were announced, no one volunteered from the old board. The power once so desperately clung to had turned to poison. Instead, Emma found herself being nominated, not because she wanted control, but because people trusted her. She refused at first. "I'm not doing this for power," she told her neighbors. "I just wanted fairness." But they insisted. "That's exactly why you should lead," one said. Reluctantly, she accepted. And in that decision, Maple Ridge began to heal. The first meeting under her leadership wasn't held in a stuffy hall behind closed doors, but on the front lawn of her home. No gavels, no raised voices, just neighbors sitting in folding chairs, coffee cups in hand, speaking freely. Children played nearby, the sound of laughter replacing the tension that had once defined the neighborhood. Under Emma's guidance, the HOA bylaws were rewritten from scratch. Fines could no longer be issued without a unanimous vote. Inspections required prior notice. Transparency was no longer a promise, it was mandatory. Financial records were made public online, accessible to every homeowner. It was accountability, built from the ashes of corruption. As these changes took root, so did something more intangible: unity. The fences between houses didn't feel like barriers anymore. People waved, shared tools, exchanged recipes. The street that once looked perfect but felt cold was now imperfect and alive. The lawns weren't all the same shade of green anymore, and somehow that made everything more beautiful. Greg's trial was held 3 months later. The courtroom was filled with Maple Ridge residents, some seeking closure, others simply curious to witness justice. When the verdict was read, guilty on all counts, a collective exhale swept through the room. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison and ordered to repay every stolen dollar. Linda, who had cooperated with investigators, received probation and community service. Robert, though not innocent, was spared legal punishment for helping expose the truth. But the real consequence wasn't legal. It was social. Greg's name became synonymous with everything Maple Ridge had vowed to never become again. The man who once wielded authority like a weapon was now just another cautionary tale. Emma didn't attend the sentencing. She didn't need to. Justice wasn't in seeing him punished. It was in knowing the fear he'd created no longer ruled her home. Instead, she spent that morning tending her garden, kneeling beside the flower box that had started it all. The lilies were in full bloom, their colors vibrant under the soft spring sunlight. She smiled as a breeze carried the scent across the yard, mingling with the laughter of children down the street. For the first time in years, peace didn't feel fragile. It felt earned. Months passed, and life in Maple Ridge settled into a rhythm of normalcy that once seemed impossible. New families moved in, unaware of the storm that had once raged here. The community had scars, but they were visible reminders of what it meant to fight for something real. Every meeting, every shared smile, every conversation carried a quiet pride, the kind that comes only after survival. Still, there were moments when Emma caught herself looking out the window, remembering the late-night arguments, the threats, the loneliness, the way Greg's voice had filled her voicemail with venom, the fear that used to live under her skin. It all felt distant now, like a bad dream fading in the morning light, and yet those memories gave her strength, because they reminded her that silence, once her prison, had become her weapon. She had learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was the decision to act despite it. One evening, as the sun dipped below the rooftops, the community gathered for their first summer barbecue under the new leadership. Strings of lights hung between trees, music drifted through the air, and laughter filled the once quiet cul-de-sac. Emma stood by the grill flipping burgers while neighbors chatted around her. Robert approached with a paper plate in hand, his expression thoughtful. "You ever think about how far we've come?" he asked. Emma smiled faintly. "Every day," he nodded, glancing around. "You changed everything here," she shook her head. "No, we all did. I just stopped pretending everything was fine." Across the yard, a group of teenagers were painting a mural on the community wall, a bright, colorful piece depicting hands breaking chains with the words "Strength Through Unity" painted underneath. Emma felt tears sting her eyes as she watched. It wasn't just art. It was a declaration. Later that night, when the lights dimmed and most people had gone home, Emma sat on her porch again. The stars shimmered above, reflected faintly in the calm windows of the houses around her. She thought about the countless people across the country still fighting their own battles against unfair boards, corrupt systems, or bullies hidden behind bureaucratic masks. Her phone buzzed again. Another message. This time from a stranger. "Your story inspired us. We're standing up to our HOA now." She leaned back, letting out a soft laugh. "Good," she whispered. "Don't stop." The next morning, Emma received a letter, an official one from the county's housing department. It commended her for her courage and leadership, acknowledging the reforms in Maple Ridge as a model for community accountability. She placed it in a drawer, smiling to herself. Recognition wasn't what she'd fought for. Peace was. As the months turned into a year, Maple Ridge evolved. The lawns grew a little wilder, but the people grew kinder. There were disagreements, of course. Real communities always had them. But they were handled with fairness, not fear. The HOA, now a true association rather than an authoritarian council, existed to serve, not control. On the anniversary of her victory, Emma hosted a small gathering. No speeches, no ceremony, just neighbors sharing food and stories. At one point, a young couple approached her, new to the neighborhood. "We heard about everything that happened," the woman said softly. "It must have been awful," Emma smiled gently. "It was. But sometimes you have to walk through fire to see what's worth saving. The couple nodded, visibly moved. We're glad we moved here, the man said. It feels different. It is, Emma replied, because now it's real. As the evening wore on, the golden light of sunset painted the houses in warmth. Children ran barefoot across the grass, their laughter echoing off the walls that once held whispers of fear. The mural glowed softly in the fading light, the painted hands breaking chains seeming almost alive. Emma looked around at the faces of her neighbors, once strangers, now friends bound by shared resilience. For the first time, Maple Ridge truly felt like home. She thought of Greg, of all the things he'd taken, and all the things he'd unintentionally given back. He had tried to break her, but in doing so, he had taught her the strength of standing firm. Sometimes justice doesn't come in grand gestures or dramatic confrontations. Sometimes it arrives quietly, in the sound of children playing, in laughter after years of silence, in the way a community chooses kindness over control. As the night deepened, Emma stood alone in her garden, running her hand along the wooden edge of her flower box. The lilies glowed faintly in the moonlight, defiant and beautiful. She whispered to herself, "You can rebuild a house, but rebuilding trust, that's the real victory." Her voice was soft, almost lost to the wind, but the sentiment lingered. The storm had passed, the scars had healed, and Maple Ridge, once a place of fear, had become a symbol of hope. The camera would pull back slowly, capturing the neighborhood bathed in silver moonlight, a quiet, imperfect but free community. And as the screen faded to black, her voice would echo one last time. They wanted control. I wanted peace. Turns out, peace was the most powerful rebellion of all. Fade out.